If you'd like to hear the show ad-free and access bonus episodes, please join me at patreon.com/Brad Cole Harris or subscribe through Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Welcome to Context. I'm Brad Harris. A few months back, I read a column by Ross Douthat in the New York Times that I found myself returning to again lately, especially in light of my last episode on the Great Silence. Ross's piece was about what he called the coming age of extinction, driven by the pressure that digital escapism and artificial intelligence are exerting on traditional human culture. But what struck me most was the conceptual frame he used to describe where we are as a species. Douthat suggested that many of the pressures bearing down on modern life, digital technology, social media, declining fertility, and now artificial intelligence, might best be understood not simply as impending extinction or cultural decline, but as something closer to an evolutionary bottleneck, a narrowing of which ways of life can sustain themselves as we move into an ever more digitally advanced future. When I read that interpretation of what we're going through as a species in the 21st century, it felt clarifying. Not because Ross's ideas were entirely novel, but because he so compellingly interpreted a pattern I had been circling for a long time. I'd been thinking about falling birth rates, about the way digital life pulls people away from marriage and family, about the strange combination of material abundance and demographic contraction that defines the developed world. What Douthat's framing did was pull those threads together and situate them inside a much longer evolutionary story. That story does not begin with smartphones or even with civilization. It begins deep in prehistory, hundreds of thousands of years ago, when the survival of Homo sapiens was fragile and contingent. The idea of a bottleneck comes from evolutionary biology. In its most basic form, a bottleneck refers to a sharp reduction in the size of a population, usually caused by some external shock, climate change, disease, migration, or environmental catastrophe. What makes a bottleneck important in evolutionary terms is not just that many individuals die. It is that the population that emerges afterward is no longer broadly representative of what came before. Certain traits, by chance or by adaptation, pass through the narrowing. Many others are lost. After a bottleneck, a population may grow again, sometimes rapidly, but it grows from a reduced base with a correspondingly distinct set of features. The future of the species is shaped disproportionately by those features, by the unique characteristics of the survivors. Like many other creatures, human beings are a species whose evolutionary history is marked not by smooth, steady expansion, but by repeated compressions. Our lineage did not steadily grow in number and sophistication. It narrowed, contracted, and nearly failed multiple times. What makes human evolution so interesting is not simply that we survived these bottlenecks, but that we emerged from each evolutionary compression transformed. One of the oldest such compressions in our species' history appears to have occurred near the very beginning, around the emergence of anatomically modern humans themselves, roughly 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. Fossil and genetic evidence suggests that early Homo sapiens did not arise as a large, dominant population sweeping across Africa, but as a relatively small and fragmented species occupying limited ecological niches. Climatic conditions across much of Africa were unstable during this period, oscillating between wet and dry phases that repeatedly expanded and collapsed habitable regions. Rather than a single birthplace, many paleoanthropologists now think of early Homo sapiens as a patchwork of semi-isolated populations separated by deserts, forests, and shifting water systems. At times, these groups may have numbered only in the thousands collectively. When conditions deteriorated, some groups vanished entirely. Others survived in ecological refuges, areas where water, game, and plant resources remained reliable enough to support human life. This matters because evolution does not simply reward survival, it rewards survival under constraint. Small, stressed populations experience intense selection pressure. Traits that might be neutral or even disadvantageous in stable conditions can become decisive when resources are scarce and environments are unpredictable. In these early compressions, survival likely favored a particular cluster of characteristics: enhanced social cooperation, extended childhood development, strong parental investment, and increasingly sophisticated communication. Humans who could coordinate, share food, care for offspring cooperatively, and transmit knowledge across generations were more likely to persist. The result was not just a reduction in numbers, but a sharpening of the species' social and cognitive profile. By the time Homo sapiens became recognizably modern in anatomy and behavior, we had already passed through at least one severe evolutionary narrowing. But of course, that was not the end of the story. Genetic evidence suggests that human populations experienced additional compressions later as small groups began moving beyond Africa into unfamiliar and often hostile environments. These dispersals were not triumphant marches. They were fragile experiments, groups moving into the Levant, Eurasia, or along coastal routes into South and Southeast Asia were small, exposed, and vulnerable to failure. Every migration represented another bottleneck, a few hundred individuals branching off from a larger population that carried with them only a subset of the species' genetic and cultural variation. If those groups survived, they did so by adapting quickly, learning new ecologies, new prey, new seasonal rhythms. If they failed, they left little evolutionary trace behind. Even within Africa, populations continued to expand and contract as climate shifted. Long, dry periods fragmented habitats. Wetter periods allowed expansion and renewed contact. Over tens of thousands of years, humanity was repeatedly funneled through narrow demographic channels, then released into brief windows of growth. What emerges from this picture is a species fundamentally shaped by instability. Human evolution was not primarily a story of growing numbers and technological progress. It was a story of volatility, persistence under pressure, and small populations surviving long enough to re-expand when conditions turned more favorable, carrying with them the imprint of the constraints they had endured. By the time Homo sapiens became globally distributed, by roughly 60,000 years ago, we were already the product of multiple evolutionary filters. Our species' reliance on social bonds, extended kin networks, cultural learning, and long-term cooperation was likely the accumulated outcome of repeated compressions that favored precisely those traits. Seen this way, bottlenecks are central to the human story. That historical reality matters because it suggests something counterintuitive. Moments of contraction do not merely threaten humanity, they define it. They determine which ways of being human persist and which disappear. It is tempting to imagine that survival pressures select primarily for strength, aggression, or cleverness. But the archaeological and anthropological record points in a different direction. What seems to have mattered most was not individual prowess, but collective resilience. Small human groups that survived extreme pressure did so by coordinating. They shared resources. They cared for offspring for unusually long periods. They transmitted knowledge across generations. They developed social norms that discouraged destructive selfishness and rewarded cooperation. In short, human beings became deeply social animals, bound together by obligation and mutual dependence. Interestingly, during more recent stages of human evolution, this dynamic of repeated compression began to recede from view, at least for a time. By roughly 40,000 years ago, anatomically and behaviorally modern humans had entered a long phase of relative stability. This is the period often associated with Cro Magnon populations in Europe, though similar patterns appear elsewhere as well. This era represents something close to an evolutionary plateau. The essential biological and cognitive features that define our species were already in place. Human brains, bodies, and social capacities had reached a form that would remain largely unchanged for tens of thousands of years. Life during this period unfolded within durable rhythms. Hunting and gathering economies persisted across vast stretches of time. Kinship structures remained stable. Seasonal migration patterns repeated themselves generation after generation. Tools improved, but gradually. Artistic and symbolic traditions deepened, but without overturning the basic structure of daily life. Innovation occurred, but at a pace slow enough to be absorbed, transmitted, and stabilized within culture rather than forcing constant reinvention. Even major environmental challenges, including dramatic climatic swings during the Ice Age, did not fundamentally reorganize the human way of life. Populations shifted and adapted, but the core pattern endured. For perhaps the first and only extended period in our species' history, continuity, not disruption, became the dominant condition. This evolutionary plateau lasted for thousands of generations, long enough to ensure that most human beings were exquisitely adapted to their environments in ways that are difficult for us to imagine today. In a previous episode on context, I referred to this phase of our evolutionary history as one during which we were, in a sense, most human. The thing is, however, long stability was the exception, not the rule of our species' history. And that's important to remember because it makes the subsequent turbulence of human civilization appear like a new phase. Although, from a longer evolutionary perspective, the volatility and rapid change associated with the era of civilization during the past several thousand years represents more of a return to normal for our kind. The late Upper Paleolithic was the interruption. Volatility and compression are the norm. Once agriculture and settled civilization emerged, human beings did not suddenly invent instability. They re entered an older pattern, but now within denser, more interconnected societies. As a result, bottlenecks became far more catastrophic when they re-emerged. As human populations concentrated into cities, food systems narrowed, and institutions grew more complex, periods of stress could cascade across entire regions within a generation, where earlier compressions reshaped populations biologically over long spans of time. Civilizational bottlenecks increasingly reshaped social hierarchies, economic systems, and cultural institutions almost overnight. At this stage of human history, survival alone was no longer the decisive variable. Biology still determined who lived and died, but culture increasingly determined what survived. Which social arrangements could reconstitute themselves once the immediate crisis passed? It's against this background that the great historical bottlenecks of the last few millennia take on a different evolutionary character. They represent the reappearance of a much older dynamic, but now operating inside the fragile architecture of civilization, and therefore far more dramatic in character and effect. There have been many such civilizational bottlenecks, but perhaps the most impactful occurred in 14th century Europe. The Black Death stands as the clearest example of this transition. It was first and foremost a biological catastrophe. When plague arrived in Europe in the middle of the 14th century, it tore through the continent with a speed and lethality that is still difficult to comprehend. In some regions, a third of the population died. In others, closer to half. Entire villages disappeared. Cities lost tens of thousands of inhabitants in a matter of months. Clergy, laborers, nobles, merchants. The disease did not discriminate by class, wealth, or virtue. In purely demographic terms, the Black Death was one of the most severe population bottlenecks in human history. Europe's population collapsed abruptly, but the loss of life was not evenly distributed across generations. The young and the working age were hit especially hard, creating sudden imbalances in labor, inheritance, and social structure. From a biological perspective, this was compression on a massive scale, but the Black Death was not only a biological bottleneck, it was also a cultural one. The society that emerged on the other side of the plague was not simply a smaller version of what had existed before. It was reorganized. The sudden scarcity of labor upended long-standing economic arrangements. Survivors found themselves in a position of bargaining power that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. Wages rose, serfdom weakened, mobility increased. In some regions, peasants acquired land, autonomy, and leverage that had been structurally denied to them for centuries. At the same time, the moral and religious landscape shifted. Institutions that had claimed authority and stability, especially the medieval church, were exposed as fragile in the face of mass death. Clergy died in enormous numbers. Rituals failed to halt the disease. The confidence that the social order was divinely fixed began to erode. In its place emerged new currents of skepticism, reform, and eventually renewal. What matters for our purposes is not whether these changes were good or bad in some absolute sense, but that the Black Death forced them. Ways of life that depended on dense populations, rigid hierarchies, and unquestioned authority struggled to reconstitute themselves. Other arrangements, more flexible, more adaptive, more responsive to scarcity, proved better suited to the new conditions. In that sense, the Black Death functioned as a selection event, not just among individuals, but among institutions and cultural forms. Certain patterns of social organization passed through the narrowing. Others did not. This is what distinguishes more recent civilizational bottlenecks, like the Black Death, from earlier prehistorical bottlenecks. It did not reshape human beings biologically in any obvious way, but the Black Death decisively reshaped the cultural and institutional environment in which human beings lived. It selected for certain economic relationships, certain power structures, certain assumptions about authority and labor. The bottleneck operated at the level of civilization, and that is what makes it a crucial bridge in the story we are telling. Earlier bottlenecks had always acted primarily on bodies and on genes. Later ones, like the Black Death and also like World War I, as another notable example, would act primarily on meaning, legitimacy, and social cohesion. The Black Death sits between those two poles. It reminds us that once human societies reach a certain level of complexity, compression no longer simply determines who survives, it determines which ways of living remain viable. World War I represents the clearest expression of that shift. Unlike the Black Death, World War I was not primarily a biological shock. It was a human-made catastrophe produced by the collision of industrial technology, mass politics, and entrenched systems of meaning that could no longer sustain themselves under modern conditions. The demographic losses were real and enormous. Tens of millions were killed or wounded. Entire generations of young men were wiped out across Europe. In some countries, the population imbalance between men and women would be felt for decades. But in strictly biological terms, the Great War did not reduce the population of Europe in the way the Black Death had. Birth rates recovered relatively quickly. The human species itself was never in doubt. What World War I compressed was something else. It shattered confidence in the moral and cultural frameworks that had governed European life for centuries. The war exposed the fragility of the assumption that progress, reason, nationalism, and industrial power naturally pointed toward human betterment. Mechanized slaughter on an unprecedented scale made those assumptions impossible to sustain. The institutions that had promised order and meaning, monarchies, empires, churches, and even the liberal ideals of the 19th century, emerged discredited. Authority lost its legitimacy. Traditions lost their persuasive force. The war did not simply rearrange borders, it hollowed out some of Western civilization's most entrenched beliefs. In this sense, World War I functioned primarily as a cultural bottleneck. It put profound selection pressure on the evolution of human ideas, values, and ways of understanding the world. The years that followed the war saw a loosening of social norms that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Clothing changed, dancing changed, relationships between men and women changed. Young people in particular began to reject the moral seriousness and inherited caution of the world that had led them into the trenches. The mood was not exactly nihilistic, but it was unmistakably urgent. Life felt short, and the experience of life felt precious. Enjoyment became a virtue rather than a distraction. Out of this atmosphere came flapper culture, speakeasies, jazz, and a more permissive approach to sex and courtship. Women pushed more openly for political and social independence, including the right to vote. The war had made Victorian restraint and decorum seem naive. At the same time, The material world accelerated. The technologies that had been mobilized for war, mechanization, mass production, chemical engineering, communications, spilled rapidly into civilian life. Finance expanded. Markets grew more complex. Investment and speculation became cultural forces in their own right. The pace of modern life quickened, and with it, the sense that history itself was speeding up. By functioning as a great bottleneck of culture, the Great War catalyzed a phase shift in modern history. The 4 years between 1914 and 1918 arguably unleashed greater cultural change than the previous 20 or even 30 years combined. What emerged on the other side felt far more like life over the next 2 or 3 generations than life in the generation just prior. A whole new way of life set in across much of Western civilization. From our vantage point, it's easy to interpret this shift as a radical expansion of modern culture. But from the perspective of those who lived through it, it would have felt more like a severe contraction, a narrowing of 19th century norms, values, and expectations. Here's another way of thinking about this. Men and women in their mid-30s or 40s in the 1920s, just after World War I ended, would likely have felt that they had less in common with somebody in their early 20s than someone in their early 60s or 70s, despite being much closer in age to the younger person. The Great War marked a profound historical divide, and those who came of age after it understood the world and their place within it in a fundamentally different way. And that particular historical consequence may be the most tangible forecast of what lies ahead in the first half of the 21st century. I am approaching my mid-40s, and my nephew is still in his mid-teens. And yet, he and I will almost certainly share a more analogous cultural experience, despite our 30-year age difference, than my nephew will share with my 3-year-old son, even though their age gap is barely over a decade. My nephew and I will have come of age on one side of the great AI divide. My son will come of age on the other. And the space between those two experiences is where the most consequential cultural bottleneck in human history is likely to form. This brings us back to Ross Douthat's argument. Douthat's insight was not that artificial intelligence will destroy humanity in some spectacular or apocalyptic way. His claim was more subtle. He suggested that AI, combined with digital escapism, may radically narrow which ways of life are capable of sustaining themselves into the future, especially those centered on family formation, long-term responsibility, and intergenerational continuity. In other words, the danger is not extinction by force, but extinction by attrition. What makes the AI bottleneck different from those that came before is that it operates almost entirely at the level of choice. No one is compelled to withdraw from embodied life. No one is forced to delay marriage, avoid children, or substitute virtual experience for real commitment. These outcomes emerge organically through incentives, convenience, and pleasure. Earlier bottlenecks tested physical endurance. Later ones tested cultural coherence. This one tests something even more intimate: whether human beings still find fulfillment in the kinds of lives that sustain civilization over time. Artificial intelligence does not simply automate labor, it mediates meaning. It offers frictionless entertainment, endless stimulation, and the promise of emotional satisfaction without any obligation. For many people, that will be enough. And for those people, reproduction, biological and cultural, may feel increasingly unnecessary. But of course, bottlenecks do not eliminate everyone equally. They filter. The people who continue to form families, to bind themselves to others across time, to accept responsibility rather than escape into simulation, will carry the human story forward. Not because they are morally superior, but because their way of life remains capable of reproducing itself. And here's the key factor. History is ruthless about one distinction that modern life tries to erase: the difference between pleasure and fulfillment. Pleasure is immediate, it's easy, and it's abundant in a digital world. Fulfillment, on the other hand, is costly. It requires patience, sacrifice, and commitment. But only fulfillment sustains a way of life long enough for it to be passed on to someone else. And that is fundamentally what this particular bottleneck in human evolution is filtering for: fulfillment. Human beings who continue to prioritize fulfillment over pleasure, who maintain the cultural discipline necessary to nourish their own family lineage, and who put in the work to maintain historical wisdom and pass it on to their children, will be far more likely to survive in an age of AI. And just as with the Black Death or the Great War, the consequences will not be evenly distributed across generations. Those who come of age on one side of this divide will experience the world in a fundamentally different way from those who come of age on the other. We will speak the same language, we will still share many of the same institutions, but our assumptions about what life is for, about what makes it meaningful, may no longer align. This is the pattern that history reveals when viewed across the millennia. Bottlenecks do not merely thin populations, they reorganize cultures. They determine which ways of living persist and which quietly fade away. And that is why the question before us is not whether humanity will survive in the age of artificial intelligence. The question is which version of humanity will. I'm Brad Harris. So long.